This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
8 black boys in a southern jail. World, turn pale. 8 black boys and 1 white lie. Is it much to die? Is it much to die when immortal feet march with you down Time Street? When beyond steel bars sound the deadliest drums like a mighty heartbeat as they come? Who comes? Christ, who fought alone? John Brown, that mad mob that tore the Bastille down stone by stone? Moses, Joan of Arc, Dessalines, Nat Turner, fighters for the free, Lenin with the flag blood red, not dead, not dead, none of those is dead. Gandhi, Sandino, Evangelista too, to walk with you. 8 black boys in a southern jail. World, turn pale. Langston Hughes.
Langston Hughes was one of the people who began to add to the voice of Du Bois, someone who could, as indicated, use his power as an artist to get the case of the Scottsboro Boys before the nation. For Du Bois, though, the Scottsboro case was a mixed affair because he had always been the person who was the most influential intellectual that African Americans had. And yet, by the early 1930s, fewer and fewer people were listening to what Du Bois had to say, particularly about the Scottsboro case. He said in his Crisis magazine, "The Scottsboro, Alabama cases have brought squarely before the Negro the question of his attitude toward communism." And for that, Du Bois felt they were making a mistake because the communists were cynically using the Scottsboro case to persuade African Americans, in his view, to join the communist movement as their only solution to their problem. At the same time, though, he was dissatisfied with the NAACP because it was not responding to the economic problems of the Depression. Now, as you know from the previous lecture, Du Bois was, by this time, going through a difficult period in his life. He had recognized the decline of his influence during the 1920s as other black intellectuals and artists emerged to be the voice that he had been almost solely through the crisis. People had, as I said, waited for the crisis to arrive because that was the national voice of African Americans. But by the end of the 1930s, on a political level, he was losing his influence. On a personal level, he was going through a very difficult period. Now, this was apparent in the aftermath of the ill-fated marriage of his daughter, Yolande, to the gay black poet, County Cullen. As I mentioned before, this was the social event of the decade for African Americans, and certainly a high point in Du Bois's life, something he saw as a crowning achievement for someone reaching the age of 60, and to see his daughter married to one of the leading figures of the Harlem Renaissance. When he began to get letters from his daughter in Paris, where the young couple went for their honeymoon, though he understood that not only had the wedding depleted his wealth, the 1,300 invitations had done that, but even more deflating was the emotional aftermath as his daughter wrote home these letters of distress. He tried unsuccessfully to convince her that she should not make her husband cater to her needs. Instead, she should help this great poet become even greater. And then he wrote a letter to his son-in-law, advising that he should just bear with Yolande and try again perhaps, and all would be well. By this time, his daughter had decided that sex was the last thing she wanted from County, prompting her father to point out his own difficulties in establishing a satisfying sexual relationship with his own wife. And he also offered the very unhelpful suggestion that sex wasn't, after all, the main thing about marriage. By the end of the disastrous honeymoon, the most celebrated African-American marriage of the 1920s was history. But even as his daughter's marriage came apart, Du Bois was also confronting the realization that his stature as the preeminent African-American intellectual was no longer unchallenged. In 1928, he had tried unsuccessfully to urge African-American voters to abandon their traditional loyalty to the Republican Party of Lincoln and instead support the Socialist Party of Norman Thomas. Then came the stock market crash, 1929, and the subsequent beginning of the Great Depression, and this had a number of effects on Du Bois. Personally, his own finances were in disarray, but it also led to a decline in the number of African Americans willing to subscribe to the crisis, which in turn made Du Bois more dependent on the NAACP, and they had allowed him to be this independent voice as long as the crisis was self-sustaining. African Americans wanted to read his magazine, but with the start of the Depression, as subscriptions went down, he became more and more dependent on Walter White, who he saw as a not so visionary leader of the NAACP. Walter White did not understand that the Depression was calling upon the NAACP to do something new, to respond to an economic crisis when its whole policy had been about the race issue. So Du Bois began to see the Scottsboro case as a sure sign that if the NAACP didn't change, it would lose the support of black people, not simply to the Communist Party, but to other groups, the black nationalists. He had also had a running battle with Garvey, and he understood the power of black nationalism in the black community. He conceded in his editorials that the communists made a courageous fight against the color line among workers. It was the only political party in the United States that took a firm stand against racism. The Democratic Party didn't, the Republican Party didn't. So he concluded that the NAACP's strategy of gradual reform was maybe the best of the bad choices open to black Americans. And he said that this notion that the communists are putting forward, that black workers are going to unite with white workers, Negroes know perfectly well, he said, that whenever they try to lead a revolution in America, the nation will unite with one fist to crush them and them alone. So what happens after the Scottsboro case is that Du Bois begins to see a new generation, a whole generation of younger intellectuals. They also, many of them, have degrees from leading institutions like Harvard. They also write books. They also begin to reach out and become the voice of African Americans. And he also finds that there's a younger generation of people like Angelo Herndon in Alabama who are more militant than he is, more willing to accept the message of the Communist Party. Angelo Herndon becomes a communist organizer during the early 1930s. Because he says he was impressed that the party fought selflessly and tirelessly to undo the wrongs perpetrated upon my race. Here was no dilly-dallying, no pussyfooting on the question of full equality for the Negro people. And one of the things that the Communist Party did, in addition to the Scottsboro case, was that they were very good at using these highly publicized cases to make their appeal. For example, there was this a dance that was held in Harlem, and they invited people to come, a lot of people they were trying to recruit, And at the dance, there was this incident where a white worker objected to a black man dancing with a white woman. And the communists reacted by putting this worker on trial for racial chauvinism. And they held a trial in a Harlem bar, put out ads saying that we're going to try this worker on the charge of racial chauvinism, invited all these people to come and watch this trial, publicized it in the newspapers, and needless to say, the worker was finally convicted of racial chauvinism, and they exerted the highest penalty, that is, to expel him from the party. And so this is the kind of propaganda, but in terms of the Scottsboro case, they did succeed in saving the Scottsboro defendant from the death penalty. They were able to overturn the initial conviction. Now, what this meant for the Scottsboro defendants didn't mean very much because, as you will see from the text, they were retried and very quickly convicted again. So the whole process had to start again. But they were able to at least delay the execution and save the Scottsboro boys. So that sent a message to the black community that here is a political force, the Communist Party, willing to take a stand. And other cases, like the Angelo Herndon case, where he goes to Atlanta and begins to organize the unemployed, white and black unemployed workers, and leads a demonstration. He's charged with insurrection, very serious life penalty, gets convicted on that. And a member of the black middle class, William Patterson, comes as the head of the International Labor Defense and begins to develop a defense for Angelo Herndon as well as the Scottsboro defendants. Benjamin Davis, member of the Atlanta middle class and the son of one of the leading figures of black Atlanta, graduate of Harvard Law School, volunteers to defend Herndon at no charge. He, as a young lawyer, hasn't had very much trial experience, but he does his best. And after Herndon is convicted, he appeals it. He's sentenced to 12 years on a Georgia chain gang. And Davis carries on the appeal and finally gets the sentence overturned in the Supreme Court in 1937. By that time, Davis has moved from being a loyal member of the black middle class, one of the Du Bois's talented 10th, and has instead himself become a communist. He said, "I entered the trial as Herndon's lawyer and ended it as his communist comrade." Davis later becomes editor of the Harlem Liberator, moves to New York, and begins a rise in political prominence that culminates in the 1940s when he's elected to the New York City Council, the first communist to be elected to political office. And of course there are other intellectuals, Langston Hughes, the poem that was just read was part of his movement to the left. He didn't become a member of the Communist Party, but he worked very closely with the Communist Party during the 1920s. And Richard Wright would be another example of someone who actually becomes a member of the Communist Party, begins to write about race issues in class terms. But at the time of the beginning of the Depression years, for Du Bois, he decides that what the NAACP needs to do is not to abandon its basic reformist orientation, but to begin to emphasize the need to deal with the economic problems by developing a better relationship with unions. And he begins to write editorials such as Marxism and the Negro Problem that that are part of his own evolution. He begins to take more seriously the Marxian notions and begins to be drawn to some of them. At the same time, he continues to reject the Communist Party attitude that only a revolution is going to solve the problems of black Americans, and it has to be a revolution of black workers and white workers. Du Bois calls his talented tens together for this conference at Amenia, New York, at the estate of NAACP board chairman Joel Spingarn. And he draws together some of the most talented figures, the up-and-coming intellectuals in the black community. People like Ralph Bunche, the political scientist, economist Abram Harris, and Charles Houston, the brilliant lawyer. All of these people were going to make their mark. E. Franklin Frazier in the academic world. E. Franklin Frazier would become the leading sociologist of black America. Abram Harris, one of the leading economists. Ralph Bunche, the pioneering political scientist. In fact, when I went to UCLA and studied history there, the history department is in the Ralph Bunche building because Ralph Bunche is a graduate of UCLA. Many of these younger intellectuals were also fascinated by Marxism. They distrusted the Communist Party, but they felt that the Communist Party was onto something, that there needed to be a movement that brought the black working class into the NAACP. As Du Bois himself recognized, the NAACP was primarily a black middle-class organization. Very few of its members were working class. Now, they saw enormous promise, though, in the ongoing effort to unionize industrial workers. The industrial union movement, which culminated in the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, was a movement that, for Du Bois and many of the other black intellectuals, held great promise because for the first time, white workers recognized the need to draw black workers into the union movement. Before that, the American Federation of Labor, which had been organized around crafts, had opposed bringing black workers and basically saw them as scabs. And actually, many of the AFL unions had anti-black clauses in their constitution. For the CIO, though, this was not a very practical option. Why? Well, because for a craft union, you had to go through an apprentice process, which meant that you could control entry into the union. If you wanted to be a carpenter, you had to go through a long process of being an apprentice. How did you get to be an apprentice? Well, you had to know somebody, be a relative of somebody who was already in the union. That was a very difficult barrier, even if the union did not have an explicit bar to black membership. For the industrial unions, though, that is the factories, the steel factories, the automakers in Detroit, the meat packing industry, these were called semi-skilled workers, which meant basically you came in untrained, you were trained on the job. What did that mean for a union? Well, that means that if you go on strike, what can happen? The factory just decides to hire somebody else, bring them in, quickly train them, and with scab workers, now the factory is back in operation and the strike is lost. Oftentimes, who are the scabs? Black workers who need the jobs. So if you don't organize them, they will prevent you from achieving your goal. And what this meant also is that the CIO unions, many of them had communists as their organizers. Communists were drawn to the CIO unions because they felt that this was their way of achieving their goal of white and black working class unity. For many of the unions, their best organizers were young communists, both black and white. Well, Du Bois felt that the NAACP needed to become more involved in the union movement to counter the influence of the communists. Now, Du Bois's relationship with the NAACP reaches a crisis. I guess I shouldn't use that word since the magazine is a crisis. Reaches a crisis in 1934 when he publishes an editorial called Segregation. Has anyone in here read it far enough in the readings to know what was the cause of this break? Yes?
Walter White was upset that he felt that he was using the crisis to criticize the NAACP, and so...
But what was the editorial about? Yeah. Do you remember? Well, it was called Segregation. So that kind of gives you a hint. What was the... Yes?
Was it that the NAACP should be doing more radical things to end segregation in America?
Okay, but it was a little bit more combative than that. He was actually saying that segregation is not always a bad thing. That the black community has to get its act together, has to, this is something that's often said today, that black people have to form their own organizations, have to build their own institutions. Ultimately, the goal is integration, but along the way, segregation might not be such a bad idea. Well, Walter White didn't want to hear that, and this was precisely the thing that they had always been worried about with Du Bois. Here is this independent voice out there. Who does he speak for? Is it Du Bois or the NAACP? It's the NAACP's journal. We didn't approve this editorial. And so Du Bois is forced to leave. He resigns. He says, "If I criticize within, my words fall on deaf ears. If I criticize openly, I seem to be washing dirty linen in public." So now he's 66 years old. Why doesn't he just retire? One of the amazing things about Du Bois is here's this guy. He's 66. He's been through all of this. He's the preeminent intellectual still. He has published the most influential book of the century in terms of African American life. He's a founder of the NAACP. The NAACP kicks him out. Why doesn't he just quit? Well, he's still got 30 years of very full life to live. And he goes to Atlanta University, begins to get back into his scholarly studies, founds a journal, Phylon, publishes Black Reconstruction, the most important book probably of that era in terms of the study of Reconstruction. Relaunches the Atlanta University Studies of African American Life, publishes another autobiography. He'll publish still another one later in his life, and gets right in the middle of all the controversies about World War II and the Cold War. But in the 1930s, other people are beginning to add their voices to the mix. For example, black nationalists. Black nationalism had fallen into decline after the imprisonment of Marcus Garvey in the 1920s, but by the 1930s, that was one of the responses to the Depression. In Detroit, for example, former Garveyite Elijah Poole joins the small group called the Nation of Islam, and he eventually changes his name to Elijah Muhammad and becomes the new group's leader. By the way, what happened to the old leader is that he mysteriously disappears, and no one has ever found out whatever happened to him. But Elijah Muhammad becomes the leader during the 1930s. It remains a relatively small group until the 1950s, of course, when Malcolm X joins and becomes the best organizer Elijah Muhammad ever had. Carter G. Woodson would be another voice, also a Harvard graduate. So that's no longer a distinction only for Du Bois. Carter G. Woodson's most famous book, anyone? Anyone read it? The Miseducation of the Negro. Good title, really great. You should read it. It's he denounced educational institutions that estrange black students from the black masses while failing to provide the practical knowledge they need to uplift the race. Higher education, he believes, should be a preparation to think and work out a program to serve the lowly rather than to live as an aristocrat. So Carter G. Woodson is also the founder of the Journal of Negro History, founder of Black History Week at that time. Now it's Black Liberation Month, or depending on who you're talking to. But he's the founder of that idea of every year having a celebration of African American history. Then there were the social gospel ministers. Adam Clayton Powell in New York at Abyssinian Baptist Church. He wants to have an answer to the Depression. The social gospel, trying to go out like Cecil Williams in San Francisco at Glide Memorial Church. Well, Adam Clayton Powell is trying to do some of the same things during the 1930s. In Atlanta, there's another guy by the name of Martin Luther King Sr., who is a social gospel minister, leading voting rights marches, trying to get equal salaries for black teachers as well as equal to those of white teachers. Another person by the name of George Baker, who's better known as Father Divine. Father Divine probably gains the most massive following of any religious leader during the 1930s. He convinces a number of followers, probably at least into the hundreds of thousands, that he is the true and living God. He preaches racial integration. He also preaches that they should give all their wealth to the movement, which is typical of a lot of groups, and it meant that he lived very well. But one of the things he did, he had his own answer to the problems of the Depression by pooling all the wealth of the black community, opening up peace kitchens, distributing free food. The free food became a way of getting new members to come in. They would then devote all of their wealth to the movement, and you would be able to deliver more free food. So it was a program that worked. It was kind of a pyramid scheme, and there's a limit to how far it was going to work. But for a long time, there was this sense that Father Divine could do nothing but good, and was able to confront problems that even the communists had difficulty confronting, because the communists had difficulty delivering a meal to hungry people. They could promise the revolution, but Father Divine could deliver food. So there were so many of the other individuals who I could name, but all of them were many of them were part of what Du Bois had always celebrated, that is the talented tenth. These were the people who were supposed to uplift the race. Now, he assumed that they would kind of follow his lead. By the 1930s, they were going in other directions. They were beginning to argue for industrial unions. They were beginning to argue for direct action tactics to deal with segregation and other problems. Many of them ultimately decided that the answers to the problems of the Depression would not come from the NAACP, but would instead come from government. Now, that was similar to what the communists were saying, but they were saying a new revolutionary government. What many of these people were saying, we've got the government. What is it? Roosevelt's New Deal. 1933, Franklin Roosevelt becomes president, and he begins to deliver an answer to the problems of the Depression. And furthermore, there is a prominent black person who becomes the face of the Roosevelt administration in the black community. Her name, Mary McLeod Bethune. She becomes the New Deal's first black official, along with Robert Weaver, the economist, who later becomes, many years later, becomes a member of Lyndon Johnson's cabinet. Now, one thing I think I try to point out in the textbook is that these individuals, these black New Dealers, played important roles, but we shouldn't overstress their influence. This is at a time when to be the most influential black person in the Roosevelt administration meant that you were the assistant to somebody who really had power. There were no black people in the cabinet. They called the black appointees the black cabinet, but that was simply because they were in a position to advise those who really had the power about policies relating to the black community. Now, the assessment of Roosevelt's New Deal and its impact on the black community, for the first time, you had an administration that was delivering a response to the Depression that benefited many black people. It delivered food. Sometimes it delivered a job. In dealing with the broader problems of the Depression, Roosevelt set up New Deal social programs that benefited mostly whites, but for the first time, black people were at least included in those who needed relief from the problems of the Depression. So a lot of the discussion about the 1930s in terms of African American history really has to do with, was the New Deal good for black people? Was it not good? Well, on a practical level, I think the question can be easily answered. Yeah, I mean, a lot of black people were thankful for the New Deal. It's not hard to see why. If you are in the rural South, for example, won't lean back against that. If you're in the rural South and you are suffering because, like all agricultural areas, they were suffering. There was not any money to buy their product, and blacks suffered more. Why? Because one of the ways you could deal with overproduction is to produce less, and that's actually what the government is trying to get you to do. Well, who's going to be hurt the most? It's going to be black workers, farm workers, because they're out of a job. The farmer gets paid not to produce, but the worker doesn't get paid not to work. But the New Deal can step in and provide relief. Now, that seems like a really good deal, but white farmers were objecting. Why? Why didn't they like this arrangement? Black workers out of work, they get relief from the government. Yes?
They're not dependent on white farmers anymore.
Right, but this means that they have some leverage. They don't have to take any wage that is offered. So for the first time, there's an intervening group between black workers and white farm owners, or black sharecroppers. Now they can get relief from the federal government. So one of the controversies about the New Deal was that the question of, does this relief get evenly distributed to whites as well as blacks? The New Deal definitely helps in terms of industrial workers. Why? Does anyone understand what the New Deal did in terms of organizing industrial workers? What was the main problem that industrial workers had in terms of trying to organize? Why would they need government help? even today. If you want to organize a union here at Stanford, with all the working class people here, you know, the people who actually keep this place looking nice and provide the food you eat every evening. If you wanted to organize it, how would government regulation help or hinder that? A thing called the Wagner Act. What it allowed was it protected the right to organize workers. To this day, Bill Gould over in the law school, one of the professors in the law school, used to be head of the National Labor Relations Board, and that was set up under the New Deal. And what it did is it meant that if you go into a factory and you start organizing workers, number one, you can't get fired just for organizing your fellow workers. Number two, when you think you are ready to form a union, the workers at the plant can vote. And if a majority support the union is formed. And that vote is supervised by the National Labor Relations Board, not by the company. So now you have the government being in the position of legitimizing industrial unions. So all you had to do as an organizer is to get a majority of the workers in the place where you were working to join the union or agree to join the union. Then the government could come in, have this election, and if the workers select the union, then you've got a union. Then you can bargain collectively with management. This was an enormously important advance, and soon after that, the CIO is formed, and the Auto Workers Union is formed, the Steel Workers Union, the Meat Packers Union. All of these unions in the industrial for the industrial workers get formed in the mid-1930s. One of them, a black union, predominantly black union. Which one was that? Yes. Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. A. Philip Randolph had been trying to organize black railroad workers on the Pullman Porters since the 1920s without great success, because what would happen as soon as the Pullman car company found out that someone was trying to organize a union, they'd get fired. That makes it very difficult to organize a union. But by the mid-1930s, with this protection, he's able to go in and finally culminate this process, forming the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Now, just a few words about Mary McLeod Bethune. I could do a lecture on her. I mean, she's an enormously important individual, someone very complex, because many of the young black radical activists kind of saw her as a spokesperson for Roosevelt and someone kind of in Roosevelt's corner, someone who's kind of sell the New Deal to the black community. But we know now from her writings and from many of the things that she was a very complex individual. She was someone who pushed Roosevelt, and particularly through her relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt, was able to get the Roosevelt administration to do far more than Roosevelt would have wanted to do. Because Roosevelt didn't want to draw attention to the race issue. From Roosevelt's perspective, the issue for the Democratic Party was to get a majority of whites to support the Democratic Party. He liked having the black vote, but he understood that the strength of the Democratic Party was in the South. The solid South was, at that time, the Democratic Party was almost the sole party in many southern states. Black people didn't vote there because they were not allowed to vote. So what would happen if civil rights became the central issue of Roosevelt's New Deal? he would lose the support of the South. So he was willing to do things that did not draw a lot of attention to them. So he was willing to say that the New Deal program should be fairly administered throughout the nation. Okay, everybody should support that. But he was not willing to say, we will support anti-lynching legislation, because that would be seen as giving in to the NAACP, and that would hurt him in the white South. Well, Mary McLeod Bethune understood that limitation. She was able to go to Roosevelt, try to convince him to do what he could. Sometimes he would do symbolic things like through appointments, black faces in high places, sometimes get the point across that here's a new administration willing to do something for black people. Now that strategy has been used to the present, and I think it means that you can do something without really changing policy. She was able to convince him to bring black people into the employment programs of the New Deal. She was very concerned about black youth, and she was working for the National Youth Administration. Well, having summer programs, work programs for young black people to go off and work in a for example, clearing roads in forested areas, working in parks and other places. All of these provided work and a wage that goes with work and training sometimes that was vital to many African Americans. She also tried the best she can. She would get Eleanor Roosevelt's ear. They developed this wonderful friendship. And Eleanor Roosevelt, probably before Hillary Clinton, was the most influential First Lady we've ever had in this country. And she was able to convince Eleanor first, then Eleanor would go and try to get to Franklin and convince him that this was the right thing to do. One of the things that I think was kind of, Bethune convinces her to go to the South and to this meeting in Birmingham to deal with the problems of the South. And Roosevelt understood that in the long run he had to deal with the fact that the South was backward, and the only way the South could really develop was to get the races together. So they called this conference in Birmingham, but Birmingham is a segregated city. So what is Eleanor Roosevelt going to do? She's the First Lady of the United States. She's going to this conference that has the backing of the Roosevelt administration. She arrives there, and Bull Connor, yes, Bull Connor, the guy who comes up in the 1960s shooting with the fire hoses and police dogs, is there in the 1930s, and he's insisting this has to be segregated. You can't have an integrated meeting in Birmingham. So Eleanor Roosevelt walks into this room, and on one side are blacks, other side whites. Where is she going to sit? She sits in the middle. That satisfied many, as the best she could do under the circumstances, and it kind of shows the way in which Roosevelt administration was willing to go part of the way toward equal treatment of all races, but not all of the way. By the end of the 1930s, we also know from her writings that Mary McLeod Bethune was herself beginning to raise some questions about the Roosevelt administration. And if Awele is here, I think there's a. Do you want to introduce the letter? She writes a letter to Roosevelt in 1939, indicating her concerns about the New Deal.
My dear Mr. President, for several weeks I've made it my business to talk with thoughtful and informed Negroes in various parts of the country. Those conferences and reports which have come to me cause me to place before you the observation of what appears to be a situation serious enough to merit careful study by yourself and others concerned with the continuation of the ideas of your administration. I have found deep affection for you and Ms. Roosevelt among colored Americans in all walks of life. They share the feeling of many other Americans that, at least so far, at the heart is concerned, you are genuinely concerned with the well-being of an improvement of opportunities for all Americans, and particularly those who are disadvantaged. But over and above this personal regard for yourselves is a widespread and growing feeling of despair, distrust, and even bitterness because of the apparently increasing control of party policy, so far as the Negroes are concerned, by Southern congressmen, senators, and others who are bitterly anti-Negro. I refer to such figures as Senator Conley, Burns, Glass, Smith, George, Harrison, and Bilbo, whose Negrophobia reached its climax in the vicious attacks on the Negro during the filibuster against the anti-lynching bill. There is puzzlement and bitterness among Negroes because even Northern Democrat senators did not raise their voices against the oft-times ridiculous attacks on the Negro. However, they are not unaware of the fact that Republican senators were equally mute. It is my conviction that it would be a serious mistake to believe that the Negro vote is irrevocably fixed in the Democratic ranks. It will be equally a mistake to believe that not only the leaders of Negro opinion, but the rank and file are satisfied with the deal the Negro has received even under your administration. Excerpt, 1939, letter to Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Well, I think that the verdict for most African Americans on the New Deal was delivered in the 1936 election. And that election was crucial because for the first time African Americans overwhelmingly supported the Democratic Party rather than the party of Lincoln. This shift, as you well know, has been a lasting shift to support for the Democratic Party, but it also placed Roosevelt in a dilemma that I think has also faced every subsequent Democratic candidate. And that is, how do you at the same time appeal for black votes while keeping the votes of white Americans, and particularly those in the South? This becomes the concern of the Roosevelt administration, the Truman administration, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and whoever is elected next, because now we see that no longer is the South a solidly Democratic region. Now the South has become, in part because of the race issue, a solidly Republican part of the country. I think Bethune tried as best she could to, rather than muzzle the criticisms of the New Deal, she gave them voice. She provided conferences where people could get together and discuss the strengths and the limitations of the New Deal. But I think outside the government, the criticisms were much stronger, and by the end of the 1930s, you begin to see the emergence of a strong critique of the New Deal by black intellectuals, and some of whom we will be talking about in future lectures. And also, I think by the end of the 1930s, what we see is the emergence of a group of intellectuals, Ralph Ellison, Zora Neale Hurston, artists such as Aaron Douglas, Jacob Lawrence, and Shirley Graham, the dramatist, who are all interesting because they become the voices, a new generation of voices for African Americans, but all of them benefited from the New Deal. All of them get their start in the arts working for the WPA, particularly the Writers Project, the Artists Projects. Some of you have probably been to many public buildings that have murals, and you'll notice that a lot of these murals are from the 1930s. And what that indicates is that this was a job that for many of the people who did those murals or actually built bridges and other things, did plays, all of these were ways of providing work for artists who were out of work. Now, for white artists, this meant that they were able to sustain their careers. For many black artists, for the first time, they were able to make a living by doing their art. The federal pay might not have been much. I think for one of the arts programs, it was like $120 a month. But getting $120 a month during the Depression meant that you were able to survive for the first time doing things like painting, writing, and other kinds of artistic activities. For Du Bois, though, by the end of the 1930s, I think his life was still, in his view, in decline. He adjusted to living in Atlanta, but for his wife, that was she did not want to return to the place where their first son had died, and it brought back all of those memories. For him, he understood that he was going there because he had been booted out of the NAACP, the organization that he had started. He did not know that around the corner they would be calling him back, and that'll be in a future lecture, that they needed him by the mid-1940s. But at the end of the 1930s, he had begun to understand that he needed to alter his political perspective. He needed to come to terms with what had gone on in the era of the Great Depression. He moves gradually to the left, and then with the advent of World War II, increasingly toward the orbit of the Communist Party. On a personal level, and I started with a personal level, so I'll end with a personal level, Du Bois, I think, is always an example to me of a tremendous intellectual who thinks, has a broad vision of the world. By the end of the 1930s, that vision was truly international, global. He helped form the Congress Committee on African Affairs, and he begins to agitate for the liberation of the colonies of Africa and Asia. He, I think, is a pioneer, along with Paul Robeson, in terms of broadening the perspective of black Americans to see the relationship between the African American struggle and the struggles around the world. But at the same time, he has this broad vision, and perhaps because he has it, because his concern is for the liberation of people around the world, sometimes there were blind spots in terms of his own personal life. Now, I mentioned that with respect to the marriage of his daughter, but this is from his autobiography, one of his autobiographies. As I said, there's more than one. And this is a reflection by Du Bois, and I'll end with this because I think that it's both poignant, honest, painful, but he's trying to come to terms with why it is that he can care so much about the world's problems, but yet on a personal level, he doesn't seem to make friends easily. People consider him aloof. He has difficulty dealing with issues of gender and sexuality, as you saw with his daughter. And he said, on one aspect of my life, I look back upon with mixed feelings, and that is on matters of friendship and sex. I couple them designedly because I think they belong together. I have always had more friends among women than among men. This began with the close companionship I had with my mother. I drank no alcoholic beverages until I went to Germany, and there I drank light beer and Rhine wine. Most of the American men I knew drank whiskey and frequented saloons which from my boyhood were out of bounds. Indeed, the chief blame which I lay on my New England schooling was my inexcusable ignorance of sex, which I had when I went south to Fisk at 17. I was precipitated into a region with loose sex morals among black and white, while I actually did not know the physical difference between men and women. At first my fellows jeered in disbelief, and then became sorry, and made many offers to guide my abysmal ignorance. This built for me inexcusable and startling temptations. I began to turn one of the most beautiful of life, Earth's experiences into a thing of temptation and horror. I fought and feared amid what should have been a climax of true living. I avoided women about whom anyone gossiped, and as I tried to solve the contradiction of virginity and motherhood, I was inevitably faced with the other contradiction of prostitution and adultery. In my hometown, sex was deliberately excluded from talk, and if possible, from thought. In public schools, there were no sexual indulgences of which I ever heard. We talked of girls, looked at their legs, and there were rare kissing of the most unsatisfactory sort. We teased about sweethearts, but quite innocently. Then I went away to Fisk, in East Tennessee. I was literally raped by the unhappy wife who was my landlady. From that time through my college course at Harvard and my study in Europe, I went through a desperately recurring fight to keep the sex instinct in control. A brief trial with prostitution in Paris affronted my sense of decency. I lived more or less regularly with a shop girl in Berlin, but felt ashamed. Then when I returned home to teach, I was faced with the connivance of certain fellow teachers at adultery with their wives. I married a girl whose rare beauty and excellent household training from her dead mother attracted and held me. I married at 29, and we lived together for many years. It was not an absolutely ideal union, but it was happier than most, so far as I could perceive. It suffered from the fundamental drawback of modern American marriage, a difference in aim and function between its partners. My wife and children were incidents of my main life work. I was not neglectful of my family. I furnished a good home, I educated the child, planned vacations and recreation, but my main work was out in the world, not at home. That worked out for me because my wife appreciated, but was too busy to, that work out there my wife appreciated, but was too busy to share because cooking, marketing, sweeping and cleaning, and the endless demands of children. This she did naturally without complaint until our firstborn died. As I wandered across the world to wider and higher goals, I sensed two complaints against the pairing of the sexes in modern life. One, that ties between human beings are usually assumed to be sexual if a man and a woman are concerned. And two, that normal friendships between men and women could not exist without sex being assumed to be the main ingredient. Also, a man and a woman are friends, they must be married, and their friendship may be cloyingly intimacy, often lasting 24 hours a day with few outside friends of the opposite sex, on pain of gossip, scandal, and even crime of engulfing the family. My travel and work away from home saved us from this. One difficulty of married life we faced, as many others have. My wife's lifelong training as a virgin made it almost impossible for her to ever regard sexual intercourse as not fundamentally indecent. It took careful restraint on my part not to make her unhappy in this most beautiful of human experiences. This was no easy task for a normal and lusty young man. As I said, most of my friends and helpers have been women. From my aunt, mother, cousins, to my fellow teachers, students, secretaries, dreamers toward a better world, Sexual indulgence was never the cause or aim of these friendships. I do not think my women friends ever gave my wife harm or unease. I was thoughtful of her comfort and support and her treatment in public and private. My absence from home so much helped in the household drudgery. I still make my own bed in the morning. For many years I prepared my own breakfast, especially my coffee. I always leave a bathroom cleaner than when I enter. I have often wondered if my wife's limitation to a few women friends, then they chiefly housekeepers, and if her lack of contact with men because of her conventional upbringing and her surroundings, if this did not make her life unnecessarily narrow and confined. My life, on the other hand, threw me widely with women of brains and great effort to work on the widest scale. I am endlessly grateful for these contacts. See you Tuesday.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.